Well, the United States has a huge amount of people that are in jail for whatever reasons, but that have strong political positions. If we're talking about political positions, we're not talking about those in the case of the United States. In Cuba, we're not talking about prisoners in our negotiation with the United States. It's a domestic issue of Cuba. It is not a bilateral issue with the United States. And the U.S. knows it. But there are many, many important issues of a bilateral nature that should and could be discussed between Cuba and the United States for the benefits of both countries. And that is what we are ready to engage with in conversations with the government of the United States.
Well, and going back to those potential issues, there is only one political party in Cuba, so currently people really have no choice. Going back to my original question, would you be willing to change that in order to save your country, given that it's one of the things that the United States is asking for?
It's a domestic issue of Cuba. The United States has only two political parties that can go to government. Are they ready to negotiate to have 10 with equal possibilities of getting to the presidency, of getting in Congress? I'm sure the United States would not negotiate that with any country. They have the willingness to do it, but I'm surely they won't negotiate it. Cuba is a sovereign nation, as I said at the beginning of the program. And of course, it's something that is not on the table to negotiate Cuba's reality. Okay. And Cuba's problems are not the result of having one party.
When did the last discussions take place between the United States and Cuba, and where?
I won't go into detail. We've said publicly that we're going to be discreet about it, and we're going to remain that way.
Can you tell me what the ultimate goal is of these discussions from your perspective? What do you hope to gain?
Our aim is to try to build a respectful relationship. The U.S. government, the current government, has said that it wants to make America great again. We have no quarrel with that. That it wants to have secure borders. We have no quarrel with that. In fact, we can help with that. That it wants immigrants that enter into the United States to do so legally, not illegally. And we have no quarrel with that. In fact, we can help with that from our side. And those are the kinds of issues that we believe are of interest of the people of the United States and for the government of the United States. We can work together to fight drug trafficking, to fight organized crime in our region, to fight threats in general in our region. And that's what governments and countries do with each other when they dialogue, when they have dialogue, and when they cooperate. We can also talk about business. There are changes taking place in Cuba today, in our investment policy, in the structure of a property in Cuba, in the way different forms of property work in Cuba, which could be best for the United States and for Americans who today cannot do business in Cuba because they are prohibited by their government. Those are issues that we can talk about, and we can find room for accommodation. We're not shut down, or we're not closed to having some accommodation if it can improve the relationship with the United States in those areas. And I'm sure there's a lot of areas in which, if we sit down and discuss meaningfully, we can have a lot of ground to work on, and for the benefit, again, of both countries.
Secretary Rubio is the son of Cuban immigrants. He has spent his career criticizing your government. In fact, at one point he was asked, is Cuba a state sponsor of terrorism? He said, without question. Can you negotiate in good faith with Secretary of State Marco Rubio?
We have a position, a long position of having dialogue, ready to have dialogue with the United States, solve our problems. And not only a long-standing position, it's the logical position. What's the alternative to having dialogue with a country with which you have problems? So we face dialogue as the natural, the logical, and the necessary avenue for us to discuss. Now, we also have experience of having dialogue with the United States, some with good results, but also some in which Cuba has fulfilled all of the commitments that we have agreed to, and yet the United States has reversed many of them. And the best example was during 2015, 16, and even 17, in which we reached agreements. Cuba fulfilled all of them, and the United States, by their own recognition, broke all those agreements and said that they will not follow what they had agreed the previous years. But still with that, we follow a dialogue.
But on Secretary Rubio specifically, is he someone with whom you can negotiate in good faith?
We are ready to negotiate with the person that the U.S. government, as a sovereign nation, designates as their spokesperson, as their lead negotiator. We're ready to negotiate with whoever is designated by the U.S. government. They're a sovereign nation. We don't interfere with that.
There are reports that Secretary Rubio is dealing directly with Raul Castro's grandson, Raulito. Is that accurate? Why is he the one who has direct contact with the United States?
I won't go into detail, but the point I need to make is that the Cuban political leadership is committed to this. United, cohesively. This is led by the leader of the revolution, Raul Castro, and by the president of Cuba, who recognized this publicly and said it publicly.
But you don't dispute that report that Secretary of State Marco Rubio is dealing directly with the grandson of Raul Castro? You don't deny that?
I won't go into details.
Okay. Let's talk broadly speaking now. The United States has made its goal of quite clear. You say that's off the table, as you just reiterated here. In Venezuela, the Trump administration forcibly removed President Maduro, as you know, and is now working with acting President Delcy Rodriguez. Iran was in ongoing talks with the U.S. when their leadership was killed. Do you believe Cuba will have a different outcome?
I prefer for people, when they judge Cuba, not to make parallels. We have our own reality, our own circumstances, and as I said at the beginning, we hope there won't be, and we don't think there's any need for there to be any military action by the U.S. against Cuba.
And respectfully, Deputy Foreign Minister, when people look at these countries, when they hear the comments by President Trump saying effectively that he does plan to go into Cuba, it seems impossible for people not to draw parallels. So why would there be a different outcome? Are you bracing for the possibility of a similar outcome?
You would have to ask that question to the United States. We are ready for any outcome, and we have to be ready.
Just wants to start, I suppose, by asking you why.
We're here as part of a convoy to bring to help bring humanitarian aid to Cuba and to raise awareness about the collective punishment that's being dealt to the Cuban people here by the Trump administration. And there is an embargo, and there has been for a long time here, for over 60 years. But now there's an embargo on oil, which is causing a lot of problems here in Cuba. So we're here to bring awareness. We also bring humanitarian aid, but also was 300 kilos of humanitarian aid coming from groups from all around the world.
No, it's yeah, from the West of America, it's 20 tons. We have personally brought 30 kilos that we've. Sorry, the numbers are all over the place here. But yeah, so obviously it's also important that we're here due to the fact that Irish and Cuban solidarity is something that goes back a long time. And so obviously it's a privilege and an honour to be here. And even under such difficult times, as the Irish understand, you still see the resilience in the Cuban people every day here.
And can you give me some sense, just of the local people you're meeting, like a sense of the sort of hardship they're experiencing as a result of the blockade?
Yeah, we were just walking around this morning there, and you see that even one of the local pharmacies, they're down to the bare bones in their medicines, and there's queues around the corner for people trying to get bread. So the people are hungry as well. And like, we know, going back as far as the forced starvation that happened in Ireland, you know, we were supported by the Choctaw people and the Native Americans who sent over funds to help people who were starving. So, you know, we know the importance of international solidarity, and that's one of the reasons why we're over here now.
The reality is here is that the struggle and the hardship to do with the embargoes and the sanctions. It's not the inability of the Cuban people to run their own country. It's to do with the embargo that is being placed on them by America, and that's the real issue here, and that's what we're trying to raise awareness about.
But like, from the moment you set foot in the place, is it obvious, lads, in terms of the people you're talking to and seeing the kind of personal effect it's having on people?
Absolutely. I mean, there's a feeling in the air, definitely. But as I said, they're a very resilient people, you know, and I don't think that this is going to get on top of their personalities and their ability to be able to find joy in the day to day. Like, we're bumping into people. For example, we met a woman last night who was asking for as little money as possible down to their child, hadn't had milk in a few days, and there was no milk in the shops, unfortunately. So they're resorting to having to buy, you know, the powdered, dehydrated milk, and you know, she was absolutely delighted to get the pennies that we had on us for her. So that just goes to show that day to day, these people are struggling to get milk for their children. So it's a real serious state. But as I said, yeah, they're very resilient people.
Like the whole kind of power grid, the whole power grid more or less collapsed, I think, on Monday, didn't it? Are the lights back on in it?
The lights are back on at the minute, but for how long we don't know. There's also there's a lot of issue with running water and stuff. There was no running water in the hotel and stuff today. But yeah, we can kind of see what's happening day to day around there. And yeah, you know that. Again, I think it's something that's been like really portrayed in the media, as Mowgli has mentioned there, that this has been made out to be that this is an issue for Cubans running the country, when we all know this is coming down to the embargo that's been here for over 60 years, and now the oil blockade that Trump has placed on top of it now, which makes, you know, life almost impossible.
Lads, can I quote you Donald Trump during the week? You know, this is how he put it when he was asked about what next for Cuba. He said, "For me, it would be an honor to take Cuba in some form. Whether I free it or take it, I could do anything I want with it." What do you make of that sentence?
Yeah, we're sitting in the Fidel Castro Center here, and we've got the history of the Cuban people and how they don't lie down, and I'm sure that they'll not lie down to Trump's words and his attacks.
Why do you think he's done it? Why do you think he's talking about taking Cuba? Why do you think he's imposed this blockade in the first place?
I mean, I think it's to do with the same reason that he's in Iran, and the same reason he took power is to do with power, to do with US imperialism. Again, the people who are suffering here are the women, the children, and the ordinary people of Cuba. He doesn't care about Cuba. He's not trying to free Cuba. He is actually causing suffering of Cuban people here directly.
Why the Cuban issue like resonates with yourselves as Belfast boys? What is it about that connection in your minds?
It's just, I mean, as Irish people in general, we've always kind of, you know, as being Britain's first colony, we've always kind of understood colonialism And with that, we've always understood the importance of international solidarity. Cuba, it's not, it's not being spoken about too often right now in the mainstream media. Irish and Cuban solidarity is something that goes back a long time. So it's obviously quite symbolic that we represent Ireland also, and trying to raise awareness in any way we can.
Do you think it'll make much of a difference?
I mean, that's, again, we're learning. We've just arrived. We're learning. We're seeing whatever possibilities we can do. Obviously, we have actively brought, so much aid and, baby formula and hygiene products and stuff that weren't really available. That's making an active difference to people day to day. We can't change the embargo. Unfortunately, that's what's going to make real change here, is by lifting an embargo and letting Cubans live and strangling the island.
Lads, I know you're not international diplomats or politicians, right? But I'm interested. Can you oppose the blockade, but at the same time call out the Cuban state for jailing opposition men, curtailing freedom of speech in the press? And will you?
I think we're here on human grounds. We're here down to the fact that people are being starved of food. They don't have the adequate medicine and stuff. We're not here to tell Cubans how to run the place. We're just here to provide some kind of relief for the time being. As you say, we're not diplomats. We don't have the ins and outs of this, but we see what's happening. Same in Palestine. It's not necessarily saying we agree with certain, states in the Middle East, but whenever you're bombing children from the sky, or in Cuba's situation, forcing them into starvation, then we're going to help in any means possible. Do you know what I mean?
From a humanitarian standing point, I mean, how can you deny for children and women? I think they should deflect and talk about other politics and to try and bring us into this other conversation to take away on here the actual situation. And we're not politicians, we're not diplomats, but we see the people that are suffering, and we see the importance of international solidarity. And that's why we're here. We're musicians, a band, and we're trying to raise awareness of what's going on here.
The real condemnation needs to be the people who are creating this, and that's Trump.
But you can do both, right? I mean, it's not just an act of humanitarianism. It is a political act, isn't it? And once you step into that space, I suppose, it's helpful to be thinking about those more complicated as well, in terms of calling out Cuba's human rights record, right? You can do both, right?
There's a crisis happening at the moment, and that's what we're here to focus on. So we're not here to debate about the politics. We're talking about the humanitarian crisis that's going on at the moment, and that's why we're here. That's why we're talking to you to raise awareness about that.
I mean, you're, as you said, Lee Moog, you're famous for your support of Gaza and now Cuba. At your level, how do you, as a band, choose the causes that you become involved in? What's the sort of worldview that directs the causes you embrace?
I mean, I suppose the anti-colonialist issues, I think that's what it comes down to as Irish people. We're more, more equipped and more, it's more, close to home to support any kind of anti-colonialist effort. Again, as I said, Cuban and Palestinian solidarity is something I grew up with. So now when I'm of an old enough age where I can be aware of these things and I can actually go and have a hopefully kind of effect to help the situation now, that's what I will do. It's something that's close to home, as I will. Mm-hmm. And again, we can't, it's where, as he just said, we are musicians at the end of the day. We're not diplomats. We are not, these incredible political minds. We just see, wrong in the world and use hopefully whatever platform we have to do good.
And if you walk around Belfast and there are years of Cubans, you're going to see Fidel Castro, you're going to see Che Guevara and there, and so we've had a long history of supporting just causes.
Yeah, I wonder why is Palestine and Cuba so totemic for the left? Can you explore that thought with me a little more?
We're trying to bring us down the road here of debating ideology and philosophy. All we can say is that when we grew up, we looked at the wall.
What's wrong with that?
Wait there. Let me finish my sentence. We're talking about we can only learn as we go along, and we know that in Cuba, the memorial for the hunger strikers, the 10 hunger strikers that died in 1981. And so that is the connection there. So we build off these connections that we have as West Belfast, and we're learning. We can't know about everything, but these are things that there is connection between Palestine and Ireland and Cuba and Ireland and all these things. That's our standing point, and we take it from there, and we learn as we go along. So we can't that's all the experts, but we're here to raise awareness. And I don't know if you're trying to find a way of like proving a point that we're here to for whatever reason, but we're here to raise awareness. And I don't know, the left stands with Cuba, with Palestine, with Ireland, and with any country that's under the hands of US imperialism.
Yeah, no, lads, I'm not trying to catch you out here. Like, it strikes me, and I've been to some of your gigs, right? So, you know, I know the vibe of the gigs, yeah? And I know it's not the same as the vibe necessarily that you're presenting here. And that's not a criticism. But I'm saying, I suppose, and of course, you're perfectly entitled to use your platform to campaign. But I suppose what I'm getting at is, given the controversy surrounding you, you know, when you say things like, the only Tory is a dead Tory, kill your MP. When you say up Hamas and up Hezbollah, do you ever stop for a minute and think, we have a responsibility to make sure that this world is a less angrier, polarized place for our young audience? Is that part of the thinking process or not?
We have got to the point where literally anybody can build a fully app without knowing how to code. This is base 44. This is the first look at the current industry.
Every interview we stand against, you know, anti-sectarianism. We grew up in Belfast and Derry. We understand, you know, sectarianism gets you absolutely nowhere. You know, we understand.
Why use that kind of language then? I suppose, Liam.
Well, you're taking sentences out of context of a wider context of a concert. So you're taking that and using that now as a means to say we're polarizing. But that is part of our act, and we have talked about this already. So I don't know why you're trying to take one sentence.
I suppose the question is, though. I'm sorry.
I think it's important to say as well, you know, that the acts of aggression, they're not coming from us as a band, they're coming from America, they're coming from Britain. You know, the real acts of aggression is the war, the genocide that's happening in Palestine, the embargoes that's happening in Cuba.
It's always asking about what do we condemn ourselves. You're never asking the question of do you condemn, you know, bombs that are being dropped in Gaza, or this embargo taking place that having to ask people on the street for money to buy powdered milk? You know, these are the real questions you could be asking about condemnation, not what happened during a gig for 40 minutes.
That's disingenuous, mate. That's not what I'm asking you. What I'm asking is, do you think a 17-year-old at your gig who's like 8 points in understands the nuance of the things you say?
I don't know. Do you know many 17-year-olds?
I do, yeah.
They're not idiots.
Mm-hmm.
You think they get that?
Yeah, but this has always been a part of our acting, part of what we do in satire. And then satire and all these things have been a big part of Irish culture and of Irish music and Irish literature for a long time. This is not a new thing. We didn't come up with this idea of satire. We are just following in the footsteps of people who came before us.
And this opens up a dialogue as well, and avenues they learn and explore new ideas.
Yeah. So, but then let me ask one more question along that line. If at your next gig somebody satirically throws a Hezbollah flag up on stage, would you wrap yourself in it again, Liam?
I don't pick anything up on stage now.
You know what I'm getting at, though? Would you do it again?
Well, I just answered you.
What?
I don't pick anything up on stage anymore.
Now you're being disingenuous. I mean, what I'm saying is, would you?
I answer it?
So just to be clear, then, Hezbollah flag on stage, you're saying you wouldn't do that again?
I don't lift any flag that comes on stage anymore.
Anymore. Why is that?
Yeah, take one guess.
You've been reading the news.
Come on. You know Fenn rightly why.
And is that upon advice from your lawyer as opposed to an ideological objection to it?
And could very well be.
What's the new album about?
That's a segue.
Well, the album Fenian is coming out in 24 for you. Of course, Fenian for a long time. Before this was a term for a warrior for during folklore, and then in later years, it was used as a derogatory slur against nationalists and Catholics in North Ireland. So Fenian kind of represents this. We're kind of reclaiming the word Fenian. We're reclaiming the Irish language. We're reclaiming our Irish identity. When that happens, maybe we felt ashamed about for a long time of colonisation. We felt like, as you know yourself in Ireland, maybe there's a negative perception of the language. So this album is an attempt of kind of getting rid of that byproduct of colonisation and feeling pride about our language and about our culture and our identity. And so not just for Catholics or for any background, it's for the whole of Ireland, because it's the language of Ireland. Ireland is a land of many people from all around the world, and everyone deserves to learn that language and learn about the land living in.
Let's bring it back to Cuba, which is obviously why you're there and in Havana. If on the extreme off chance that Donald Trump is tuning in to Channel 4 News, what is your message to him?
I think it's hard to reason with somebody like that. I think if he had any kind of, heart, I mean, take it from us that we're here, and these people who, as he said, this is collective punishment he is putting on the Cuban people. These people are starving. They're not being, they don't have the correct availability to whatever medicine is needed. This is affecting newborns. This is affecting pregnant women. This embargo is going to have, a lot of repercussions for the Cuban people. I'm sure that's by design for Trump. So I'm sure he's not listening.
I'd love Trump to actually read a book. I don't know if he reads books, but read a book about Irish history and about the struggles of Ireland and colonisation, because we all went through the same similar processes that are happening in Cuba and happening in Palestine. So, I mean, I would maybe offer him a few suggestions of books, but I don't think he reads many books.
Well, go on then. And what would you recommend?
Oh, I recommend. Okay, let me see here. So, what's a good book on colonisation of Ireland? That's not Ireland. I mean, if you look at what's a good book now? Bandit Country is a good one. And colonisation. I mean, there's a book written from the perception of a colonizer and how they viewed Irish people as subpar, subhuman, and that's from the view of the colonizer. I mean, there's many books in Irish history that teaches us about the famine that we had here, the way they view people, and how they weaponize. In Ireland, they weaponize food, they weaponize our resources to control the population, and that's where we see similarities of weaponizing things that people need, people's human rights. They're weaponizing everything. So there's many books. I'll take those books and I'll send them on to you. Send them on the
Good man. Last question. I was reading. There's an Irish connection with Che Guevara, isn't there? On the maternal side, his father's maternal side, they're Lynches.
Yeah, it's called Lynch.
Lynch. Yeah. So there's long-standing connections there. I keep seeing Ireland.
Well, obviously Castro landed in an airport.
Yeah.
So he paid a flying visit to duty free.
No cigars in Shannon duty free. I'm afraid. I know for a fact.
He was absolutely did. He was.
Kneecap, thank you very much for your time. We appreciate it.
Yeah,
Is Donald Trump about to invade Cuba?
We'll be doing something with Cuba very soon.
He keeps saying he'll do something about it, but what and when?
Whether I free it, take it, I think I can do anything I want with it.
We should absolutely take Trump seriously.
So, about to become the next Venezuela or even the next Iran. Here's the breakdown with Tyler Anderson.
After successfully overthrowing Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, Donald Trump now has his sights set on one of America's oldest enemies.
I do believe I'll be having the honor of taking Cuba. That's a big honor.
Cuba's communist government has been a thorn in America's side for nearly 70 years. But now, President Trump is ramping up the pressure to a whole new level.
Cuba looks like it's ready to fall. I don't know if they can hold out. We could very well end up having a friendly takeover. And it may be a friendly takeover. It may not be a friendly takeover. It wouldn't matter. It wouldn't be a very tough operation.
Trump's Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, is of Cuban descent and has been critical of the regime for his whole political career.
To ensure that the fight for Cuba's freedom and liberty continues in Washington, D.C.
Cuba's status quo is unacceptable. Cuba needs to change.
Since America's decapitation of Venezuela's leadership, Trump has blocked oil shipments to Cuba, at times leaving the whole island without power and causing shortages of food, water, and medical supplies. The blockage has led to widespread protests, which are often taking place in the dark.
They have no energy, they have no money, they're in deep trouble on a humanitarian basis.
Cuba's president, Miguel Diaz-Canel, says any attempt to take control of Cuba will be met with impregnable resistance. But Trump believes this decades-old enemy has never been weaker, with the president leaving the door open for yet more regime change in the region.
Tyler Anderson reporting there. Now, the problem with the way that Donald Trump talks about these things is that sometimes he's serious, but sometimes he chickens out. That's why the term taco, Trump always chickens out, is used. Earlier this year, he made repeated threats to take over Greenland, but after European and other allies stood firm against it, he backed off. So how do we know which way he's going to go on Cuba? Well, to break it all down, I want to bring in our very own assistant producer out in Washington, Izzy Rowland. She's had to listen to more Donald Trump speeches than anyone else and can help us work out just what he means this time. Izzy, thanks for joining us. It must be pretty early over there.
It is, Andrew. We're 4 hours behind at the moment, so it's not as brutal as before the clocks change, which were normally 5 hours. But at the moment, I'm not really getting much sleep with the whole Trump administration, and it's been relentless and crazy.
What do you make of what Trump's saying about Cuba then? Do you think we should take him seriously?
Well, it's funny you should say that, Andrew, because I think we should absolutely take Trump seriously. You know, he's a man of words. He says a lot of them, might I add. Being in the Washington Bureau, I hear him day in, day out, speak for hours on end sometimes. You know, when we look at what's been happening in Iran, he's acted on that. He has not made empty threats with Venezuela. He captured Nicolas Maduro and his wife, who are now awaiting trial in a jail in New York. So I think the world should absolutely take Trump seriously. You know, when he says things, he does act.
Yeah, I mean, and people also talk about this taco term, the Trump always chickens out thing. Why do you think Trump cares about Cuba?
Well, it's funny you should say that, Andrew, because, you know, Cuba logistically is only 90 miles from Keys in Florida, and Florida is a big part of Trump's persona. He's got his Mar-a-Lago club there, and he's always flying back and forth. When we think about the history of the US, there's this Monroe Doctrine. It's all about the US's assertion in the Western Hemisphere, which has now been dubbed as the Monroe Doctrine. It's basically taken away Russian and China influence, and strategically, it would be a move that I think Donald Trump will.
And so do you think people will be surprised by this? You mentioned this fitting into the Monroe Doctrine, the so-called Monroe Doctrine. Does this fit in then with what's come before?
I think so, yeah. I mean, when you talk about President Trump's agenda, you know, he was all about America first. And I don't know whether this is him protecting America, keeping an eye on host nations. But when I speak to people on the ground, we're behind the scenes of film, people voted for Trump because they didn't want these never-ending wars. I spoke to one guy who wouldn't come on camera. His son is in the military. He basically said, I didn't vote for Trump to get involved.
Do you think he's quite representative of what people are feeling in America at the moment? Do you think people are feeling let down by the way that President Trump has continued to act?
Some people are really scared to shout about it, but then, other people that we spoke to at the diner, they're like, yes, great. They saw Venezuela as a massive success. But it's interesting because I also speak to people behind the lines, even though they've told me that they've, voted for Trump, they're not wanting to go on camera because they are disappointed. He portrays this America First agenda, but is this really America First when he is wanting to meddle in and have fingers in all the pies, quite frankly?
I also want to ask you about Marco Rubio, obviously a close ally of President Trump and also of Cuban descent. How much do you think he's driving all this?
He is very much a close ally of Trump wherever Trump is. Marco Rubio is basically. You mentioned that he is of Cuban descent. His parents came here in the 1950s, just before the Cuban Revolution. And in his 2012 memoir, he sort of recalls times when he was listening to his granddad tell stories about Cuban hero. He would one day want to lead, Cubans back to Cuba. So I think emotionally, he's very invested in this land that his parents seem to have given up so he could, have life here.
You mentioned the history there, Izzy. Beef between America and Cuba, it goes back decades, doesn't it?
Yeah, it goes back to the 1950s when Cuban communists overthrew a US-backed government. And then, Cuba aligned itself with the Soviet Union. That then leads us into the missile crisis, where Americans had feared Cuba could be used to attack the US. We spoke a bit before about the logistics of where Cuba is.
And what's happening in Cuba at the moment?
A couple of months ago, the US imposed an oil blockade. They've not had oil imports for about 3 months, which has basically sort of suffocated the country from within. They're having electricity blackouts, which have had a massive impact on hospitals, on schools. There's a lack of food. We're seeing protesters take to the streets. I saw a video the other day where pro-democracy protesters had attacked the Communist Party HQ. So it's fair to say, there is a humanitarian crisis at the moment.
Is there any support for the US to do something?
Yeah, absolutely. You look at the number of, Cubans in the US at the moment, it's about 2.5 million. There is, for President Trump's actions, people have been outspoken about the communist regime. This week there were pro-democracy supporters outside Trump's Mar-a-Lago home for him to do something. And because I don't know if it's fair to say he rules with an iron fist, but, Cubans are looking for President Trump to do something. And it goes back to the point where when he says something, he's more than likely to do it. He says a lot of stuff. But, as we've seen with Iran and Venezuela, he is a man, let's say.
So Trump talked about negotiations. What are they?
There's been what people are calling sort of like high-level sensitive talks. Trump is wanting a regime change, so he wants someone else in power. And they're also wanting a prisoner release deal. There was protests on against the government, and the protesters were given two options, either prison or exile. So they're wanting people to be released. There are a couple of strands to these talks, but primarily it's all about Trump wanting someone else in power, and maybe someone who politically aligns more with Trump. It's all about having friends rather than foes, especially on his doorstep.
Nice one, Izzy. Thanks very much for the insight. Speak to you soon.
Thanks, Andrew.
That's the breakdown. Thanks for watching. See you next time.
Oil blockade on Cuba has made no misery for the Cuban people. They're short on electricity, they often suffer blackouts, rolling blackouts, and indeed on Saturday the island was plunged as a whole into darkness as an island-wide blackout took place. That's the second island-wide blackout in just 2 weeks. But the current blockade of energy, of oil, isn't the only source of Cuba's woes. Been subjecting the country to embargoes for overdevelopment, it's restricting its economy and punishing its people as a whole. I was in a meeting with Deputy Foreign Minister of Cuba, Carlos Fernandez de Cosio, where we were allowed to ask questions as journalists or other journalists there. There was Ryan Grimm from Dropsite, there was Owen Jones, various other journalists, and we were permitted to ask one question each of the Deputy Foreign Minister. But before we got to ask questions, he began with a sort of short explanation of US foreign policy when it comes to Cuba and what its impacts have been.
People many times ask, what is the problem that Cuba has with the United States? And what's about that, including historical background. But if you want to put it in a thin synthesis, it would be the failure, historically and still today, of influential elements within the US political class and government to accept the notion that Cuba is and has the right to be and has the right to self-determination. And that in Cuba, us Cubans, we fully believe in those rights and in those prerogatives. What does the US want with Cuba? Restoration of capitalism, in the way capitalism was prior to the Cuban Revolution, which was fully dependent on the United States. It was a neo-colony state. And the US also wants a relationship of dependency, to force Cuba to be dependent economically and politically of the United States.
Now, the long-held US foreign policy position on Cuba is that the country is obviously really poor, and recent economic shocks like COVID, just 6 years ago, 7 years ago, 5 years ago actually, hasn't helped at all. Means the country hasn't been able to make upgrades to critical infrastructure like its electricity grid. So it's not just that the oil embargo is causing blackouts happen in the past. It's also because the country hasn't been able to invest in its infrastructure. Some of that infrastructure, energy infrastructure, is really, really old. It's sort of Soviet era, and it's not actually very easy to get the parts to make sure that the parts actually work with that kind of equipment. So there's a current crisis of the blockade, but there's a much longer ongoing crisis of just not being able to access through trade restrictions, through monetary restrictions, through political restrictions, the kinds of things that Cuba needs in order to keep going. And as you walk around Havana, which I've done a lot of in the last few days, you can see everywhere how that strangling of the economy by the US, largely by the US. I'm not saying that there haven't been mistakes made by Cuban governments, but there's always happening. All decisions are happening within the context of this ongoing, decades-long foreign policy approach to Cuba by the US. You can see how that's impacted the actual fabric of the city. There are crumbling buildings everywhere. In the very center, parts of the very center, buildings are sort of collapsing. Roads aren't in very good repair. And there have been other issues as well with the current blockade. Like, for example, garbage is not being collected. So in some parts of the city, you can see really large piles of garbage just on the streets. 40, 50 feet long, and a couple of feet high, where basic services are not operating as they should, or as people would like them to operate. And of course, those buildings that are coming down, those are homes, but still living in many of them. But that policy, as I say, that decades-long policy has kind of reached its most intense phase with current blockade, Trump's blockade, and Cosio described what he took to be its ultimate aim.
The situation that we face today is of the United States applying a brutal aggression based being powered against a relatively small country, with few natural resources, and at the same time putting in place a very forceful campaign to try to blame internationally and even domestically in Cuba, to try to blame the Cuban government for problems facing society today. They know that their policy causes harm, that it causes irritation. If you have 36 hours without electric power, and the consequences of not having then availability of fresh, if you have problems of transportation to go to work, to take your children to school, if you need a long surgery and you have to wait for weeks because there's not sufficient power, there's not sufficient health material, in a country that for decades has ensured health services of quality for free for the whole population, then naturally that provokes irritation. It provokes desperation in some people, and in some people, a motivation they need to protest, which is natural. Anywhere in the world you find that people would want to protest what has happened. That is, in many ways, the aim of the policy of the United States.
It does seem to me, in speaking to many Cubans while I've been here, that policy is working. You'll meet many Cubans who are pro-revolution. They believe in the 1959 revolution that was obviously driven by Fidel Castro, and which got rid of a very wealthy elite and structured the country and its constitution as a communist country. So many Cubans still believe in the power of that revolution, still believe in its importance. But many are also critical of the current government. They also think that the government has, failed in various ways over the past decade to make kinds of investments in the country or to resource various structure correctly. So yes, you get those criticisms, and some people are actually quite angry, and there have been protests about blackouts on the island. That is true. But so far, I haven't met anyone who wants the US to control Cuba in any way, who wants the US to be involved in any way. For many in Cuba, not those outside of Cuba, for many in Cuba, Americans are the enemy, and they see America as a source of, their suffering. They don't see it as the only source, perhaps, but they do see it as playing an essential role in it. One thing that I think has been really clear to me, and it's been actually quite sad sometimes, is that a lot of Cubans actually describe themselves as feeling hopeless. As one said to me, Cubans are generally a hopeful people, but their hope is fading away. And of course, the view of Cosio is that that's what the US government wants. It wants Cubans to feel hopeless, it wants degraded and broken, so as to make it easier for the US to step in and take over, which is kind of what Trump said he wants to take Cuba. None of the Cubans that I've spoken to really seem to know what the solution to this crisis is, and it is really a crisis. And I was allowed to put one question to Cosio, and what I wanted to ask about was that sense of hopelessness amongst the people. So I asked him, what is the government doing internally to ameliorate or to address that sense of hopelessness? What is it doing, economically, politically, psychologically, make Cubans able to endure this crisis better than they have been already, or to allow them to continue to endure it and with a bit of hope? He spoke about basically about longer-term projects, about securing Cuba's energy and food self-sufficiency, about building infrastructure so dependent on fossil fuels, and he talked about developing sectors of the economy which are currently underdeveloped. And all of this, he said, would be extremely difficult under Trump's blockade, but the alternatives he laid them out, he thought, were impossible.
The alternative is warfare, military warfare, or the acceptance of the takeover of Cuba. The acceptance of Cuba going back to capitalism. Capitalism is not the future of Cuba, it's the past. And going back to being a client state of the United States. And that is unthinkable for the Cuban society.
Now, you probably know this already, but one thing that Cuba is really famous for is providing doctors to countries that need them. Cuba has sent literally tens of thousands of brigades of doctors and other medical workers to countries to help them build up their healthcare systems. 20,000 of them currently work in countries in Latin America, in the Middle East, and in Africa. And indeed, during COVID, Cuba sent doctors to Italy, you remember, very hard hit by COVID very early on. And it was Cuban doctors who were sent by Cuba to go and help out the Italian health system in Turin. But according to the Americans, that should all come to an end.
The US magazine published practically a blueprint, or a version of a blueprint of what it's planning to do. They say they want to erase any Cuban doctors from the Western Hemisphere, which is also the same as saying we want to deprive millions of people of health care that they never had before the Cuban brigades were there, and they will never have again once the Cuban doctors leave. And if we multiply that to Africa, to the Middle East, even to European countries, it will be the same situation. The U.S. is ready again to deprive millions of people of healthcare, which is a human right, for the sake of punishing Cuba.
This energy blockade, this crisis, this Washington-created crisis, is affecting literally all of Cuba's society, in its leaders. Cosio was asked by another journalist what the impact had been on him and his family, and this is the answer he gave.
The last time when the grid went off, in our home, we had, I think it was 36 hours, no electricity. Yes, the following day was 14 hours. Yes. Yeah, I truly don't know. I have to ask home, because I leave home without power and I return without power. And many times then you have water, because there was not enough availability. And sometimes when I have lack of water at home, I think automatically that I also have no electricity. So you get punished like that. In my family, my son has to pedal 14 kilometers a day to go to work. And he's an electrician. He works in the electrical company. And he has to go home to a blackout with no electricity.
That was a meeting with a very, very senior official at a time when US President Donald Trump is talking about taking the island. So talking in territorial terms, in terms of and obviously lots of journalists in the room wanted to know about the state of the negotiations between Washington and Havana over whatever's going to happen next, or, I don't know what the way out of this is. He obviously didn't really want to be drawn on that, because those negotiations are ongoing, and so he was fairly discreet about the details. But he did say that any attempt to try and conduct a sort of Venezuela-style decapitation of the government here in Cuba just wouldn't work in this country. It's not the same as